Hi, this is Father Bill W. here in Austin, Texas, and welcome to the podcast. I am an Episcopal priest. I've been in recovery for, if I make it to the end of this month, it will be 47 years. So, been at this thing a pretty long period of time. And part of my story is that at 20 years sober, I was kind of floundering and really in need of going deeper. And that's when I discovered and really dived into the history of AA and particularly came away from that study with an appreciation for the kind of prayer they did in the Oxford group and in early AA quarters. It was called two-way prayer. And if you haven't visited our website, I'd encourage you to do that. It's twowayprayer.org. And you can get in touch with me if you've got a question or a comment. Love to hear from you. You can reach me at twowayprayer@gmail.com. Spell that with TWO. We're continuing this series on the spiritual origins of AA. We're going back to that to study them. And sometimes my experience is if you'll hear something a little bit different from a different perspective, it can open you up to a newer understanding of what is really at the core of our recovery process. That's certainly what happened to me when I started studying the Oxford group. I left there with a different understanding of the steps because they didn't have steps, but they did have a process. And as I got deeper into understanding that process, it then resulted in my having a different understanding of the steps. So hope that can work that way for you as well. We're using a book, probably not the greatest book in the world to understand the Oxford group, but it's a good one for doing podcasts because the author breaks some of the concepts down into 8 different chapters. He calls it the 8 points of the Oxford group. It's written by a fellow by the name of C. Irving Benson, Australian, and you can download that from the internet if you want to dive into it a little bit more deeply. It's free out there for the having. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to go and do it. The episode that we're dealing with today has to do with restitution. We would call this our 8th and 9th steps, making amends. And he starts off in an interesting way. He was a Methodist minister, and so he's constantly going back to some scriptural reflections on some of the Oxford group points, and I think that can be helpful. So he starts off saying that theologically, we've made a big deal in the past over Christ reconciling man to God. But he says we've forgotten that Jesus was actually a lot more interested in our reconciling ourselves to one another. And he begins with quoting the chapter in Matthew, the 5th chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. And that was really important to the Oxford group people. Dr. Bob said Sermon on the Mount, 1 Corinthians 13, and the letter of James were the texts, the spiritual texts that people went to over and over again in the Oxford group and in early AA before there was a big book. And out of those, they really got deeper into a spirituality of action, because those particular scriptures challenge the ego and challenge the ego system. And every alcoholic and addict that I know, that's part of the spiritual journey, is taking apart that ego and then putting it back together in a new way. Anyway, he starts off with this quote from the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "If you're bringing your gift to the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, first go and be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift." Benson states real clearly, and this is a quote, "We cannot make effective contact with God while our hearts are choked with resentments." And anybody just coming into a 12-step program immediately we're faced with this resentment question. It's like, what's all this focus on resentment and anger? It was kind of pissing me off when I first heard it. And they're saying, you're very angry. Well, yes, I was, and it's still an issue with me that lets me know things are not right inside. So we focus a lot on resentments in the 12-step process, and I think a part of the reason for that is it's really where the program first emerged. Frank Bookman, who was the founder of the Oxford Group and really conceptualized many of the spiritual principles that became our steps, he was really transformed only through the experience of a deep resentment that he had. And the story is this, perhaps you've heard it before, but it's always good to go back to it because Frank Bookman always went back to it when he kind of told his story, because it was really significant. And it goes like this, that he was a Lutheran minister in Philadelphia. He was working at a home for young men, unemployed, poor, and he was feeding these guys and housing them and helping them get back on their feet. Probably some of them were alcoholics, no doubt. But he had a board of directors for whom he worked. And one evening there was a board meeting, and the board came and they said to him, Frank, you're spending too much money feeding these guys. We want you to cut back on your food bill. And Frank, having an ego, got very angry with them. And he quit his job, told them where they could take the job and shove it, and he left. And what he learned over the course of the next several weeks was that there was a deep-seated resentment towards the board that he was harboring, carrying with him. And to that exact same degree that he was separated from those 6 guys on the board, to the same degree he was separated from God. It was almost like a mathematical equation. So that you can't be experiencing the love of God if I'm also experiencing a hatred towards my fellow man. And that's why we in recovery are so insistent on going inside and clearing up many of these deep-seated resentments, because they block the light of God from coming into our hearts. And that is what is needed if we're going to find recovery. Bookman realized what he was doing, and he made, I guess, the first amends to those fellows on the board. He wrote each one a letter and apologized for his behavior, his anger towards them. Don't know if he ever got a letter back. That wasn't nearly as important as it was for him to own his part of the problem, and that's what he did. So that blockage became really foundational with Bookman when he was working with people. What is it that's separating you from God? It's probably something where you are separating yourself from other people. So begin to look at the resentments in your life. Bookman used to talk about working with constipated Christians. I like the phrase that they were blocked, and that they needed to identify that block and loosen that block so that the love of God and the light of God could come into their hearts. So, what we do in the steps is, I kind of like this simple analogy of putting it into 3 parts. The first part of the program is making an initial connection with God. So that's steps 1, 2, and 3. That's the connection. I call it the connection phase. Then steps 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 are the correction phase. In other words, we've established a relationship. There's a God out there. Hopefully, we're saying we don't have to have full belief in him. The belief is actually going to come through this next series of actions on our part as we begin to correct what is wrong inside of our lives. And so that's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then after we've done the correction, 10, 11, and 12 have everything to do with living guided lives. That in step 10, we watch on a continual basis what's happening inside and outside of us. 11, we seek through prayer and meditation to improve that conscious contact with God. And in that, we get guidance. We receive guidance. See, that was so critical. And that's the piece we've lost in modern 12-step work. We've lost that idea that guidance comes through the prayer and meditation. So that's what that website is about. And once again, if you have not visited it, I would really encourage you to do so. And even more so, I'd encourage you to begin the practice. So that's step 11. Then step 12 is we take action. We complete the guidance. We act on the guidance that we have received from God. So going a little deeper into this amends business, and again, using Benson, I think there are 3 or 4 things we can take away from this chapter. He quotes scripture again. He says, "He who doesn't love his brother, whom he can see, cannot love God, whom he has never seen." So again, it's in making changes to my relationships with people that I am going to affect a change in my relationship with God. It's almost like put God aside for a while. Let's not try to figure out God. Let's try to do what God is guiding me to do. And what he's guiding me to do is to clear up my relationships with other people. And Benson says that the churches have things backwards. They say, don't try to love God and then go forgive your neighbor. It says, try forgiving your neighbor, and therein you will discover the love of God. See, Bookman had lost his connection with God because of his resentments. And it was only by owning up to that, seeing his wrong in the fight, it was only then and seeking forgiveness from the board that he then found the love of God flowing into his soul. Benson writes, "There can be no realization of God if we are wrongly related on the human plane. A cherished resentment, a harbored grudge, an unforgiving spirit, an unconfessed wrong. These are what keep us from seeing God." And another point that Benson makes in this chapter is that if we go through this process, we are going to discover a new God, that the God of our understanding has to keep evolving. It isn't that you just find this one experience of God and boy, you just stay with that for the rest of your life. I don't think that's accurate. I think when you enter into a relationship, just like into a marriage relationship, it goes on and over time, you get deeper and deeper into a relationship with that person, and you fall deeper and deeper in love with them. It's not the kind of love you have in the beginning. It's very different, but it's much more mature and accepting and understanding and forgiving and richer. Here's another quote from Benson in this regard. He says, "We all know people who profess to believe in God, who would be hurt if they were thought of as atheists and would loudly deny it, but who in their human relationships are as hard as flint, arrogant, unyielding, and implacable. They walk among us believing in their God, but it is not the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ that they worship." And there's the change. So what is being said here is as I go and I make these amends in my life, my relationship with God is going to change as a result of that. And he adds as kind of a footnote, he says, if we have missed Christ on every other road, we may find him along the road of restitution. Very important process. We're not going to experience the program unless we take these steps very seriously and work at them in a very radical way. See, Bookman never referred to himself as a reformer. And I think you could say the same about Jesus. Jesus was not a reformer of Judaism. He was a revolutionary. And Bookman felt that he was a revolutionary as well. And he felt that if there's not a new kind of Christianity, a really felt and experienced, in-depth kind of Christianity, the kind that changes lives, if there's not that, then we're going to drift off into all sorts of other isms: communism, fascism, capitalism, materialism, that is a search for God, but it's going to be a frustrated one, and it's going to bring real chaos to the world. So many of us alcoholics, we've gotten particularly skilled at harboring these resentments, and in that sense, I think maybe we have a leg up on the earth people, because if we don't address these, then they're going to take us down very quickly. We become good. I certainly became good at nursing resentments that I'm always looking for one. And here's another quote from Benz. He says, half a day's steady thinking upon some slight make it appear one of the greatest crimes of the century. Once we have formed the habit of nursing grievances, we shall never lack one to nurse. So just be mindful of that we've developed, we say we're very sensitive, and I think we are. But part of that is an ego sickness of just waiting to be offended. We take slight at the smallest little thing, and then we react so out of proportion to the event. And that's just part of the immaturity that goes along with addiction. I mean, many of us feel like we stopped growing at a certain age. Mine was about 4 or 5 when the maturation process kind of hit a snag there, and drinking didn't come along till much later. But my emotional maturity was stuck, and when we begin the recovery process, that's one of the things we're going to run into is a whole lot of immaturity that we have to grow through and can't get around and avoid. There's just no way but going through it. So then later in the chapter, Benson addresses the question of when should we do it? When should we make these amends? And that's some bad news for us here. He says, if we are the injured party, we must take up the initiative because we are in the stronger position. And so what he's saying there is you can't wait until the other person, I mean, we know it takes 2 people usually to make an argument, and we can't wait for the other person to take the action. We need to do that ourselves. And the reason he's saying we need to be the ones who are doing that is because at this stage, there has already been an inflow of God's grace into our lives. By the time you get to by the time you get to 8 and 9 in the program, you've had deeper experiences of sharing this stuff with another person, of turning your life over to God's care with complete abandon, and you're ready for this. And so God is with you in making the amends, and that's really important. That we have caught hold of something that is more empowering than anything we had found before. And so we're taking that into the amends process. My hardest amend was to my father. And my father was a violent alcoholic, and I suffered emotional and physical abuse at his hands. And when I was doing my fourth and fifth step, he came up, and the guy I was doing it with said, okay, when it was kind of going through the list of people I had resentments towards, and we're trying to figure out where to go from here, he said, well, you're going to need to make an amends to your father. And I said, for what? I was waiting for him to come and make an amends to me, which was never going to happen. And what he said to me is, you got to see your part in this. And what was my part in this? And I'm feeling the victim. Hey, I was just a little kid when this stuff happened to me. But you know what? My part in that was that I withheld my love from my father. And you can't do that selectively. Had to learn that in order, trying to protect myself, which made good sense as a kid, protect myself from the violence and the madness. Sure, you're going to put up walls, you're going to put up defenses, but they not only kept him out, they kept other people out, and they kept me locked in there. And so it was only by getting the courage and the support of God in going to make that amends that I was finally able to do it. Took me 3 trips to New York to do it. First 2, I couldn't do it. The resentment was just so strong. Got back on the plane and didn't do it. Third time was the charm, and I did it. And that's another lesson that he brings up in the chapter, that some amends are going to take time. And that's maybe why we have an 8th step and then a 9th step. It does take some time to gain the courage, to gain the determination to go and to do these things, and it's not just saying I'm sorry. It's living out that amend in a relationship when there's been infidelities and when trusts are broken. The expectation on the part of the other person is that you're going to do this again. And so that amend is not just I'm sorry I did this, but it's a change of behavior that constantly brings me back to God and constantly brings me in need of God's help to live through the change that I have now determined is God's will for me to do this. But our egos are always going to be there telling us some alternative plan, some easier, softer way that they have discovered. Hey? Bookman took this business about making amends to the level of diplomacy. And that's one of the reasons AA has no opinion on outside issues. See, Bookman had a lot of opinion on outside issues. He said, the only way you're going to change the world is if you change individuals. But then those changed individuals have a responsibility to go out and work with the people around them, to change them, to work with your community, to change your community, to work with your nation, to change your nation. It's a very different concept than AA's singleness of purpose. We are only here to help struggling, sick alcoholics and addicts. See? They were not there just for that, and that was one of the reasons that Wilson wanted to leave the Oxford group, because he wasn't interested in changing the world. He was only interested in changing alcoholics. Another point Benson makes here is seek guidance when and how and even if I should be making this amend. He says this: each person must decide the thing to do on his own guidance, checked perhaps by the guidance of others. One of the guiding questions of restitution must be whether good will be accomplished by it, or whether the one who has done wrong is simply seeking a personal release from the burden of his sin at the expense of the one he has wronged. When I did my 5th step, thank God I did it with a a man who was well grounded in recovery and pretty close to some of the early principles of the Oxford group. And I wanted to go out and make amends to so many people that I had harmed. And we looked at those relationships, and many of those people had gone on with their lives. I had come like that tornado ripping through their lives, and had done bad things. Uh, but did I have a right to re-inject myself into their lives? And we went through them. Some I did and needed to do it because we were in ongoing relationship. Some of them, particularly some old girlfriends, who had kind of gotten over me, and I wanted to go tell them, well, now I understand why our relationship didn't work out so well. It was because I was an alcoholic. Well, I was looking for to feel good myself, and it wasn't going to be at all helpful or a good thing for them. Benson asked about what about people who have died? And that's where he introduces the concept of living amends, that how we treat the people in our lives today will in some measure, some mysterious way, be appreciated by the people who have died, to whom we owe amends, but cannot do it in person. There was a woman in Detroit where I got sober, and she had lost two of her daughters in an accident that she had partially caused. And the way she did the amends was to work with young women in the AA program in Detroit. And she had 100 people who just loved her, young women, to whom she became a mother. She said to me, I have 100 daughters now. That was a living amend. Let's see. I guess I want to end by just saying the spiritual life, as we say in the program, it's not a theory, but it's an experiment that we have to enter into. And as we do these steps, as we take these actions, deep changes are going to happen within us. And so I'd encourage you, if you've got an amend that you have not made, that you've been putting off, bring it to your prayer, see what your guidance is from God, and perhaps there is something that you need to do either for that person or perhaps in the lives of another person. And then closing, Benson really wraps up the chapter nicely, because he returns to the story that opened it. And that's the man bringing his gift to God's altar. And there he's told to leave it and go first be reconciled to his brother. But Benson reminds us that Jesus' story doesn't end there. It says, then come back to the altar and offer your gift. Benson says, it'll be the same altar, but it will not be the same gift. The gift is never the same when that person comes back. He gives not only something, but someone, himself. And there's the transformation. There's the change. Recovery, the journey of recovery is the death of an old self and the birth of a new one. And it's that new one that I am giving at God's altar. And that's what brings excitement to the journey of recovery. I mean, if you just approach this thing in very sterile manner, that's what I was kind of doing for my first 20 years. I'd done it seriously, but it wasn't a living relationship with God. So if you can make that transition, it makes a huge difference in your recovery. So anyway, I hope some of this has been helpful to you. Take it to heart and put it to work. Thank you for listening. God bless, and keep coming back.